Seraphine Cole had exactly 4 coins left in the pocket of her dress when the elder's letter arrived. She did not open it slowly. She did not sit down. She read it standing in the doorway of the tiny room she rented from old Mira, and when she reached the 3rd line, her hand tightened on the paper until it crinkled at the edges. Her name had been entered into the Ashwood mating auction rolls. The date was 3 weeks away. Attendance was not optional. She set the letter on the table, turned around, and walked back into the kitchen to finish washing the 2 plates she had been working on before the knock at the door. Her hands moved through the soapy water. Her face stayed completely still. That stillness was not calm. It was the particular kind of quiet that comes when a person has already run out of ways to be surprised by bad news, and has moved, without realizing it, into a place beyond shock, somewhere closer to a flat and colorless acceptance. She was 22 years old. She had been living alone for 8 months, since the night her father lost his footing on the river path, and did not make it back to the shore. Before that, it had been just the 2 of them for 6 years, since her mother left the territory quietly and without explanation, taking nothing but a small canvas bag and whatever she had been planning long before she walked out the door. Seraphine had been 16 that morning. She had come downstairs to find the house exactly as it always was, except that her mother was gone, and the silence in the rooms felt wider somehow, thicker, like something had expanded to fill the space where a person used to be. She had learned, in the years between then and now, how to take care of herself. She worked at the market 3 mornings a week, carrying crates and keeping inventory for a merchant named Owen Pratt, who paid fairly and asked no unnecessary questions. She cleaned the upper floors of the Ashwood Council Hall 2 evenings a month. She took in mending when her eyes were not too tired. She was not thriving, but she was managing, and managing, she had discovered, was its own kind of victory when the circumstances were working against you. The problem, and it was the problem that sat at the center of everything now, was that she was also 14 weeks pregnant. She had not told anyone, not Owen Pratt, not old Mira, not the young woman named Clara who lived 2 doors down, and sometimes brought Seraphine bread on the days she looked particularly pale. She had not told a single person, because there was no safe way to tell anyone, and because the father of the child she was carrying was a man whose name she did not know, and whose face she had seen only once, 3 months ago, at a private event she had been hired to work, and had never been meant to truly enter. The auction was in 21 days. She was already beginning to show, just slightly, just enough that the dress she had chosen for the market this week was the one with the extra fabric at the front, the looser one, the one she had started reaching for, every morning now out of quiet necessity. She did not have a plan. She had something smaller than a plan. She had a direction, a single next step, which was to get through the next 24 hours, and then the 24 hours after that, and to keep her expression steady and her secret close until she figured out what came next. The morning of the auction, she was already awake before the light came. She had not slept well, but she had slept enough. She ate the last of the bread from the previous day, drank 2 full cups of water, and sat at the small table in her room for a long moment, with her hands flat on the wood. The signet ring was in the left pocket of her auction cloak, wrapped in a small square of cloth. She had found it on the garden bench the morning after the event 3 months ago, sitting in the damp grass next to the stone railing where she had sat with the silver-eyed stranger for the better part of 2 hours. She had picked it up without thinking, slipped it into her work apron, and then spent the following week telling herself she would find a way to return it. She never had. The engraving on the inside of the band was intricate, and she could not read the script clearly, but the crest on the face of the ring was unmistakable. A crown of branches above a running wolf, a symbol she had seen somewhere before and could not quite place. She wrapped herself in the cloak, tucked the cloth-covered ring into her pocket, and walked to the great hall in the early gray light, alone, because there was no one to walk with her. The great hall was already full when she arrived. Ashwood held these auctions 4 times a year, and they drew observers from 3 surrounding territories, people who came to bid, people who came to watch, and people who came simply because a crowd always draws more crowd. The hall smelled of candle wax and cold stone, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the fires burning at each end of the long room. The light was golden and harsh at the same time, the way candlelight in large spaces always is, bright in some places and deeply shadowed in others. Seraphine was assigned a number, 14. She found the other women on the list, gathered in an anteroom, to the left of the main platform. most of them clustered in small groups, speaking quietly or not speaking at all. She found a place near the wall and stayed there. She did not introduce herself. She pressed her back to the stone and breathed slowly and tried not to count the minutes. The baby moved. It was the smallest motion, a faint flutter, more like a suggestion than a movement, the kind of thing she might have missed if she had not been paying close attention. But she felt it. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach through the fabric of the cloak and held it there, not because the movement hurt, but because the movement made everything suddenly and completely real, in a way that all the planning and worrying and quiet survival of the past months had not quite managed to do. There was a person in there, a small, unborn, entirely unknowing person who had no idea where they were or what was happening, or that their mother was standing in an anteroom, waiting to be auctioned to whoever raised their hand. Seraphine took one breath, then another. Then she straightened her back against the stone wall and looked straight ahead and kept her face arranged into the expression she had been practicing for 3 months, the one that said, "Nothing is wrong, and I am fine, and there is nothing here you need to concern yourself with." The auctioneer called number 14, 20 minutes later. She walked out onto the platform and into the light and the noise and the watching faces of 200 people, and she fixed her eyes on a point at the far end of the room and held herself still. The bidding started low. She had expected that. Unranked, unmated, no pack affiliation. She was not, on paper, an appealing prospect. The first few bids came from the middle section of the crowd, from men she did not recognize, and the numbers climbed slowly, unenthusiastically, the way bids do when no one is particularly excited, but feels they should at least participate. Then the room changed. She felt it before she heard it. A shift in the air, a collective held breath, a sudden straightening of spines across 200 people at once. And then the voice came from the back of the hall, from the shadows near the entrance doors, and it said a number so far beyond anything that had been offered in the previous 10 minutes, that the auctioneer actually stopped and blinked and looked up. The crowd parted. They parted the way water parts for something large and certain moving through it, without hesitation, with a kind of automatic awareness that this was not a person you accidentally blocked. The man who walked forward was tall, dressed simply for someone who was clearly not a simple person, with dark fabric and a quiet severity that made the elaborate dress of the other high bidders look suddenly overdone. He had broad shoulders and dark hair, and the kind of face that is not traditionally handsome, but is completely arresting, the sort of face that people remember in detail long after a meeting ends. He had silver eyes. Seraphine's brain made the connection, and then immediately refused it, the way a mind will refuse information that is too large to absorb all at once. She stood on the platform and she stared, and she told herself she was wrong, that the light in this hall was strange, that silver-eyed men were not actually rare, that she was projecting, that she was frightened and exhausted, and her mind was manufacturing familiar things out of the faces of strangers. And then the baby kicked. Not the faint flutter from the anteroom. A real kick this time, deliberate and insistent, the first one she had felt clearly enough to have no doubt about what it was. Her vision went white at the edges. She had one clear, complete thought before the floor tilted and the candlelight scattered into pieces. The ring. It was in her pocket. It was going to fall out of her pocket when she fell, and she could not stop falling, and she could not stop any of it now. The stone of the platform came up to meet her, and the crowd's noise rose to a sharp peak, and the last thing she was aware of before the darkness was the sound of rapid footsteps crossing the hall floor toward her, moving fast, moving with the certain urgency of someone who has just seen something they cannot allow to go wrong. She did not see who reached her first, but she felt a hand close around her arm before she hit the floor, and the grip was steady and sure, and it held. In that cold hall, with 200 witnesses and a life already altered beyond recognition, Seraphine Cole passed out for the first time in her adult life, her secret safe, for exactly the next 3 seconds, until the small square of cloth and the signet ring inside it slid from her pocket and landed with a precise, quiet sound on the stone floor, directly at the feet of King Kalen Voss. 3 months earlier, on a night in early autumn, when the air had just begun to carry the first real sharpness of the coming cold, Seraphine had been assigned to work a private event at the Thornvale estate on the western edge of the territory. She had not been told much about the event. Owen Pratt had been the one to pass the assignment along, mentioning casually that it was a high-end gathering, that the pay was 3 times her usual rate for an evening's work, that she would need to wear the black uniform that the estate's head of staff would provide, and that she was expected to be pleasant, quiet, and invisible, in the way that good hired help is always expected to be invisible at events where the guests consider themselves important. She had arrived at the estate at 4 in the afternoon for the briefing. The Thornvale house was enormous, with high ceilings and polished stone floors, and a formal receiving room that could have held her entire street. There were 12 of them in the hired staff for the evening, and the head of staff, a narrow-faced woman named Gill, had walked them through the plan with brisk efficiency. Seraphine's assignment was the garden courtyard, keeping the drinks refreshed on the outdoor tables, collecting empty glasses, making sure the candles in the lanterns along the stone paths did not go unattended. The event was a masked gathering. She had not expected that, but it was not unusual for this kind of private occasion, the sort where wealthy people wanted the freedom of anonymity for an evening, the freedom to speak a little more openly, to be slightly less careful, to exist temporarily outside their usual roles. All the guests wore masks. The masks ranged from simple and elegant to elaborate constructions of feather and gilded metal, and the effect in the lantern light of the courtyard was genuinely beautiful, in a way that Seraphine noticed despite herself, despite the ache in her feet and the weight of the tray she was carrying. She was coming around the corner of the east garden path just after 9 o'clock, tray in hand, when she heard someone in the private section beyond the stone railing. The private section was off limits to guests, she had been told, a small enclosed garden within the garden, meant for the family's own use. She set her tray down on the nearest outdoor table and went to check whether a guest had wandered through the gate by mistake, because guests at events like this occasionally did wander, and it was part of her job to quietly redirect them. The man sitting on the bench beyond the railing was not wandering. He was sitting very deliberately, in the particular way of someone who has chosen this exact spot for a specific reason, which was, she guessed almost immediately, to be alone. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders and dark hair, and his mask, a plain thing, dark and simple, covering the upper half of his face, sat slightly loosened, pushed up at one side, as though he had been on the verge of removing it entirely when she appeared. He looked at her without alarm. She looked at him, and registered his eyes, which were silver, which was unusual enough that she noted it involuntarily, the way you note something that does not quite match the expected pattern. She said she was sorry to disturb him, and that she believed this section of the garden was reserved, and he said he was aware of that, and he said it without defensiveness or apology, in the calm way of a person who does not feel the need to justify their choices. She should have turned around. She had work to do, and guests to attend to, and she was being paid for an evening of efficient invisibility, not for standing at a stone railing having a conversation with a man she did not know. She did not turn around. Later, she would struggle to explain it in a way that made logical sense. There was something in the way he sat that was not arrogant, which she had expected from a man at an event like this one, but tired, in a bone-deep way, and something in the quality of his silence that did not feel like the silence of a person who wants to be left alone, so much as a person who has simply forgotten what it feels like to be in the company of someone who does not want anything from them. She asked if he minded if she sat on the outside edge of the railing for a moment, because her feet were hurting, and the outdoor chairs were visible from the main courtyard, and she was not supposed to be caught sitting down. He said he did not mind. She sat on the stone edge of the railing with her feet hanging over the lower path, and for a little while neither of them spoke at all, and the silence was comfortable in a way she had not experienced with a stranger before. He asked her eventually how she had come to be working an event like this, not in a condescending way, in a genuinely curious way, the way someone asks a question when they are actually interested in the answer. She told him about Owen Pratt's market, and the mending work, and the council hall cleaning, and she told him about her father, and the river path, and she was not entirely sure why she told him as much as she did, except that he listened in a way that made telling things feel safe, without interrupting, without redirecting, without offering immediate solutions, the way people often do, when they are not really listening, but are simply waiting for their turn to speak. He did not offer his name. She noticed this, but did not press it. In a masked gathering, anonymity was the stated arrangement. She offered her own name, because she was not at the event as a guest, and therefore felt the rule applied differently to her, and because she had always found it easier to speak honestly, when she had begun by introducing herself honestly. He repeated her name once, quietly, as though placing it somewhere carefully. Seraphine. And then he said nothing else about it, but she had the impression it had landed and stayed. They spoke for close to 2 hours. About small things mostly. The estate's garden, and the way the lanterns reflected in the small fountain at the center of the private section. About books they had read, and which ones had stayed with them. About what it felt like to be responsible for things that were larger than yourself. A subject he approached carefully, as though touching something that had sharp edges. She did not ask him what those responsibilities were. She had the sense that the reason he was in this particular garden, behind this particular gate, at this particular hour, was precisely because he was taking a small break from exactly that question. At some point, the sounds of the main event began to quiet, and she realized she had been absent from her post for far longer than was acceptable, and that Gil was going to have a number of precise and justified things to say to her when she reappeared. She stood up, straightened her uniform, and said that she needed to go. He stood up too, automatically, and for a moment, they were close enough that she could see the actual color of his eyes clearly in the lantern light, silver gray and steady, and there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, like a person who was genuinely seen, rather than efficiently processed. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She walked back through the gate and along the path, and spent the next 40 minutes working twice as fast to make up for the time she had lost. And she did not look back at the private garden even once, because she knew if she looked back, she would find it harder to keep walking. She returned to the estate the following morning, to collect her payment, and the coat she had left on the staff room peg. The courtyard was empty, cleaned already, the outdoor tables bare. The private garden gate was closed. She was walking past it on her way out, when she glanced through the iron bars out of a habit she had not previously known she possessed, and saw, sitting on the wet grass beside the stone bench, a signet ring. She stood at the gate for a full minute. She told herself not to go in. She went in. She picked up the ring and turned it over in her palm, and looked at the crest on the face, the crown of branches above the running wolf, and thought she should ask Gil how to return it properly. She went to find Gil. Gil was busy, and told her to leave it at the front desk. She went to the front desk. The front desk attendant took one look at the ring, and blanched slightly, and told her that was not the sort of thing the front desk handled, and that she should speak to the estate's senior household manager, who was in a meeting, and would be available Thursday. Seraphine, who was working Thursday, put the ring in her apron pocket and took it home, and spent 3 weeks telling herself she would sort it out. She never did sort it out. She found, as the weeks passed and the morning sickness arrived, and the world narrowed around the growing certainty of what was happening inside her body, that the ring was the one small object she could hold on to, that connected the night in the garden to something real. She knew this was not rational. She knew that the man on the bench was a stranger, whose name she did not have, who was connected to an estate she had worked once, and would likely not work again, whose ring she had technically taken from someone else's property, and should properly have returned through official channels at the earliest opportunity. She kept it anyway. She wrapped it in a small square of clean cloth, and put it in the pocket of whatever she was wearing, every day, for 3 months, the way a person keeps a small stone from a particular beach, not because the stone is valuable, but because the beach was, briefly, the place where something shifted. By the time the elder's letter arrived with her name on the auction rolls, she had stopped asking herself why she was still carrying it. Some questions, she had learned, do not have answers that logic can reach. Some things you carry not because you can explain them, but because putting them down feels like losing the last piece of a thing you are not ready to let go of yet. She carried it to the great hall. She carried it onto the platform. She was carrying it when she fell, and she was carrying it, technically, right up until the moment she was not. Until it slid free of her pocket and landed on the stone at the feet of the man with the silver eyes who had just crossed an entire hall to reach her, moving with the certainty of someone who already knew, before he arrived, what he would find. The garden, the bench, the lantern light, the 2 hours that she had tucked away in the private, unexamined place in her chest where she kept the things that mattered. She had spent 3 months carrying his ring without knowing whose it was. He had spent, she would later learn, approximately the same amount of time looking for a woman named Seraphine, whose last name he had not thought to ask for, at an event attended by 300 people, on an estate whose staff records were private, and whose head of household, Gil, did not believe that guest inquiries about temporary hired workers were any of the guests' concern, regardless of how they were phrased, or who was doing the phrasing. Fate, it turned out, had a particular sense of timing. It had waited until she was standing on a platform in front of 200 people with nowhere to go, and then it had arranged everything neatly and without mercy, and let the ring do the rest. The physician's room smelled of dried herbs and clean linen, and the light coming through the single high window was the pale, level light of mid-morning, and Seraphine became aware of these things one at a time, in the careful sequence of a person waking up in an unfamiliar place and taking a careful inventory before moving. She was lying on a bed that was significantly better than any bed she had slept in for the past 8 months. The pillow under her head was reeled down. The ceiling above her was stone and high, with carved corbels at the corners, the kind of architectural detail that belongs to old buildings built with the confidence of people who expected them to stand for centuries. She was still in her auction cloak. Someone had removed her shoes. She turned her head to the right and found 2 people in the room with her. The first was an older man in a gray coat, who had the calm, practiced demeanor of someone who had spent a career delivering news of all varieties, and had learned to keep his face neutral, regardless of what the news was. He was standing to the side of the room near a small wooden cabinet, and he gave a small, precise nod when he saw her eyes open. The second person was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, and his eyes fixed on a point near the window, which meant she had a moment to look at him before he looked at her. She used that moment. The silver eyes she already knew. Everything else she was seeing clearly for the first time without a mask between them, without shadow and lantern light softening the edges of things. He was younger than he seemed at first impression, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of face that arranges itself naturally into severity, but has lines at the corners of the eyes that suggest the severity is not the whole story. He was wearing dark clothing with no particular ornamentation except for a narrow ring on his right hand, and he was holding something in his left hand, held with the careful, closed grip of a person who is working very hard not to show what they are feeling about whatever they are holding. She knew before she looked what was in that hand. He looked at her then, and the quality of the silence in the room changed. It did not become warmer, exactly. It became denser, more aware of itself, the way the air in a room changes when the actual subject, that everyone has been avoiding, finally arrives in the center of it and cannot be talked around anymore. He said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Fine," which was not entirely true, but was close enough. The physician crossed the room, asked a series of brief and professional questions, checked her pulse and her temperature, and then straightened up and looked between the 2 of them with the careful expression of a man who has understood the full dimensions of the situation he is in the middle of, and has decided the most useful thing he can do is be entirely precise, and then step back. He said, "She's well. Mild dehydration, likely the contributing factor to the episode. The pregnancy itself appears to be progressing normally. She's at approximately 14 weeks. He paused. The bloodline signature was apparent during the examination. A shorter pause. It is consistent with the Voss line. The room absorbed this information. The man against the wall did not move. He did not react visibly. He was very still, in the way that people are still when they are exerting a significant effort to remain so. Seraphine looked at the ceiling. She had known this moment was going to arrive, in one form or another. She had spent 3 months knowing it was coming, and being unable to do anything about the timing or the circumstances or the audience. She had imagined it many times in the small, sleepless hours of the night, in the room above Mira's kitchen, lying on her narrow mattress with her hand on her stomach, rehearsing possibilities. She had not imagined it quite like this. A physician's room, a stone ceiling, the man himself 6 feet away holding a ring that had spent 3 months in her pocket. She sat up slowly. Her head did not swim this time. She was steadier than she expected. He said, "I remember you." She said, "I remember you too." He said, "The garden." She said, "The garden." He unfolded his arms and walked to the chair nearest the bed and sat down, not because he was tired, but because standing over a person who is lying down is a particular arrangement of space that he seemed to have decided he did not want between them. He set the cloth-wrapped ring on the table beside the bed without comment. He said, "You were going to return it?" She said, "I tried. The front desk told me to speak to the household manager. The household manager was busy. I ran out of time." Something moved across his face that was almost the beginning of something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same general direction. He said, "I spent a significant amount of time trying to find you." She said, "Gil doesn't share staff records." He said, "No, she does not." A pause. "I am aware." She looked at him directly. She said, "I need to know what happens now." It was not a question. It was a practical demand, the kind that a person makes when they are in a situation that has moved well beyond the point where they can afford the luxury of circling around the point carefully. She needed information. She needed to know whether she was about to be quietly returned to the Ashwood auction rolls, whether the pregnancy was going to be treated as a legal complication, whether she was in any danger, whether her child was in any danger, whether the next hour was going to look anything like the previous one, or whether everything was about to change again. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he turned toward the doorway and said, to whoever was standing outside it, "She stays. No questions." His voice was even, and not loud, and had the particular quality of a voice that does not need to raise itself to be obeyed. He turned back. She said, "I don't even know your name. Your full name." He said, "Kaylin Voss." She repeated it quietly. It settled somewhere. He said, "I know this is not how you would have chosen any of this to happen." She said, "No, it is not." He said, "I can't fix the last 3 months. I can tell you that from this point, you are not going to manage this alone." She looked at him for a long time. She was trying to read whether he meant it, whether this was the kind of statement that sounds like a commitment but is actually a management decision, whether she was being offered genuine safety or a more comfortable version of a situation she still had no control over. She had learned, in the years of managing alone, to read the difference, and the difference mattered more than almost anything else. She could not tell. Not yet. He was too well controlled, and she was too new to his face. But the physician had moved discreetly to the far end of the room, and the room was warm, and the bed was the best she had been in for 8 months, and the ring was on the table beside her wrapped in the cloth she had cut from the hem of an old skirt, and had been carrying next to her through every difficult week of the past season. She said, "All right." It was not trust. It was the first small step in the direction of determining whether trust was possible. The two things are different, and she knew the difference, and she intended to keep knowing it. Outside the door, footsteps moved in the corridor. The palace was waking up around her, and she was in the middle of it, and the situation was nothing like any of the possibilities she had rehearsed in her narrow room above Mira's kitchen in the small, sleepless hours of the night. But she was not alone in it. And for the first time in 8 months, not being alone in it felt like something she could, very cautiously, allow herself to notice. The east wing of the Voss Palace had been the family's private residential section for 4 generations, and it had the particular quality of old spaces that have been lived in by the same family long enough that the furniture and the light and the arrangement of rooms carries something of the people who have occupied it. The ceilings were high but not cold. The windows looked out over a walled garden below, bare now in the late autumn but still shaped, still intentional, with the careful geometry of something that had been tended for a long time. Seraphine was given a suite of 3 rooms at the end of the east corridor. A bedroom with a window seat and a view of the garden, a sitting room with a small fireplace and a writing desk and 2 chairs angled toward the fire, a washroom with a copper tub and a window above it that let in afternoon light. The rooms were clean and quiet and larger than anywhere she had lived since childhood. She walked through them twice on the first evening, slowly, cataloging them, because she had learned that cataloging things was a useful way of grounding herself in new situations. She knew where the doors were. She knew which window could be opened easily, and which one stuck at the left corner. She knew the view from each angle. This was not paranoia. It was the careful habit of a person who had been responsible for their own safety for long enough that the habit had become automatic, as unremarkable as checking that a door was locked or that the fire was properly banked before sleeping. A household attendant named Petra had been assigned to her, a young woman with red hair and a practical manner, who delivered meals without hovering, who answered questions without elaborating unnecessarily, and who had, Seraphine noticed, the particular quality of someone who has been very well briefed on a situation and has made a professional decision to treat it with absolute normalcy. Petra brought dinner on the first evening: good soup, bread, a portion of roasted chicken, a glass of water with sliced apple in it. She set the tray on the writing desk, said the kitchen was available for requests at any reasonable hour, and left without making the interaction into anything more than what it was. Seraphine ate everything. She had not eaten a full meal in a single sitting for several months, because a full meal required money, and she had been very careful about money, and the habit of rationing had become so embedded that she had to consciously remind herself that there was more on the tray if she wanted it. She slept that first night in the wide bed with the down pillow, and she slept longer and more deeply than she had in months, and she woke in the gray early morning with the brief, disoriented certainty that she had overslept for work. Then she remembered where she was, and the memory settled over her like a weight that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but was simply large, and she lay still for a while and let it be large. She had been in the palace for 2 days when she began to understand that the palace was not a single thing. It was, she realized, several things occupying the same space and operating simultaneously. There was the formal palace, the public face, the receiving rooms, and the grand hall, and the corridors used for council business and official movement, where the architecture was designed to communicate authority, and where the people who moved through it did so with the deliberate quality of people performing their roles in an ongoing production. There was the working palace, the kitchens and the supply rooms and the household management offices, where the actual business of keeping a large building operational was carried out with quiet efficiency. And there was the private palace, the East Wing, the rooms that were not on official routes, where the quality of the light and the sound was different, more muffled, more human. She was in the private palace, but she was not, she quickly realized, invisible in it. She noticed it first from Petra, who was careful in her politeness, in the slightly too careful way of someone who has been told to be careful. Then she noticed it from the 2 household guards posted at the end of the east corridor, who acknowledged her when she passed, with exactly the degree of respect that one would extend to a person whose status had been determined at a level above them. Then she noticed it from the council liaison, a young man named Dre, who appeared on her 3rd morning with a polite knock and an overly smooth manner, and a list of routine administrative questions about her background and history. Questions that were phrased as necessary paperwork, but were quite clearly something else. She answered every question directly, and gave him nothing he had not asked for. After he left, she sat in the chair by the sitting room window and thought carefully about what she knew, which was, she was in the palace, she was being treated with formal consideration, and there were people in this building who had very specific feelings about her presence, and were currently in the process of deciding what to do about those feelings. She had not seen Kalen since the physician's room. He had been available, technically. Petra had mentioned twice that he would be in the East Corridor study at the late afternoon hour if she wished to speak with him, but available and present were different things, and she was getting the sense that Kalen Voss operated very deliberately in the gap between them. She understood this. She was not offended by it. A man who has just discovered the existence of a child he did not know about, in the middle of whatever else he was already managing, was entitled to the time it took to arrange his thoughts. She was doing the same thing herself. The difference was that she was doing it in 3 rooms, at the end of a quiet corridor, and he was doing it while simultaneously running a kingdom, and whatever was unresolved between them was going to wait until the more immediate structural questions were settled. On the 4th day, she went looking for the palace library, because she needed something to do with her hands and her mind, and there were limits to how long she could sit by a window thinking. Petra gave her directions, and she walked through 2 corridors and down a short staircase, and found the library in a high, long room on the ground floor of the East Wing, with shelves reaching nearly to the ceiling, and a rolling ladder on brass rails, and 3 large reading tables with good lamps, and the very particular, very welcome smell of old books and settled dust. She was there for 3 hours. She read from a book of territorial history that she found on the 2nd shelf from the end, which was dense with detail and required concentration, and gave her head somewhere to go that was not her own situation. She was still reading when she became aware that she was no longer alone in the room. The man who had entered was not Kalen. He was perhaps 50, with silvering hair, and the kind of polished, deliberate bearing that belongs to people who have spent decades in political environments. He wore a coat with formal trim, and he carried 2 books under his arm, and he moved to the far reading table and sat down without acknowledging her, which she took at first for simple distraction. Then he looked up, and the look was not distracted. It was very precise. It lasted approximately 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she was assessed, catalogued, and filed in a way that made the back of her neck register something she would not yet call danger, but was certainly in the same family. He said, "Miss Cole." She said, "Yes." He said, "Lord Drace, Senior Counsel Advisor." A pause. "I trust you are finding your rooms comfortable." She said, "Very comfortable, thank you." He said, "Excellent. The palace can be disorienting, for those who are new to it." Another pause, with the specific weight of a pause that is carrying more than the words before it. "We find it is generally best approached with a certain amount of patience. Things are rarely quite what they appear to be in the first days." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I appreciate the advice." He smiled. The smile was practiced and warm on the surface, and had something very different underneath it, and she identified the thing underneath it in the same moment that she identified it in the look he had given her 2 minutes ago. Not threat exactly, not yet. Assessment. The kind of assessment that precedes a decision, and the decision had not yet been made, and the outcome of the assessment was going to matter. He took his books and left 10 minutes later, pleasantly, with a small formal nod that was perfectly courteous, and communicated nothing, except that the conversation had ended at his choice, rather than hers. She sat with the territorial history open in her hands, and did not read a word of it for the next several minutes. She had known, intellectually, from the moment Kaelin said she stays and no questions, that staying was not going to be uncomplicated. She had known that a palace was not a safe house, that a palace was a place of arranged power and competing interests, and people whose roles depended on the maintenance of particular arrangements, and that she was now a variable in those arrangements that had not previously existed and could not have been planned for. She had known this. Knowing it had not made sitting across a reading table from Lord Drace and feeling the weight of his assessment, and understanding that it had not resolved in her favor, it had not made that easier. It had simply made it unsurprising. She closed the territorial history and put it back on the shelf, exactly where she had found it, and walked back to the east wing. On the way, she passed the end of the corridor, where the 2 household guards were posted, and acknowledged them, and they acknowledged her, and none of them said anything about what the next days were going to hold, or how many of the people currently in this building were going to decide, in the quiet and deliberate way of people who work in political environments, that the easiest solution to the variable she represented was to make the variable go away. She reached her rooms. She sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the bare garden was gray in the late afternoon light, geometrical and still. She pressed her hand to her stomach and felt the small, steady presence there, and thought, "You are not going anywhere. Neither am I. Whatever this is, we are going to figure it out." The fire in the small grate had burned low. She got up and added 2 pieces of wood from the basket, and knelt there for a moment with her hands on her knees, while the new flames took hold, and she let herself feel, just briefly, the full size of the thing she was in the middle of. She let it be as large as it actually was, and then she stood up and went to the writing desk and asked Petra, when she appeared with the evening tray, whether the afternoon study hour was still available. It was time to stop waiting for the palace to reveal itself to her. It was time to start learning what she was actually dealing with. The door to the East Wing study was slightly open when she arrived at the late afternoon hour, which told her either that it had been left that way by oversight, which seemed unlikely for a person who appeared to do very little by oversight, or that it had been left that way deliberately, which meant she had been expected. She knocked on the frame anyway because knocking was a choice, and she wanted to begin the conversation from a position of choosing. He said, "Come in." The study was a working room, not a formal one. It had the arrangement of a space that was actually used, with papers on the desk that were not staged for appearance, and a coat draped over the back of one chair, and a lamp that had been moved from its original position on the shelf to the desk because that was where the light was needed. He was sitting behind the desk with one document in his hand, and he set it down when she came in, and did not try to conceal it or cover it, which she filed away as information. She took the chair across the desk without being invited to, because being invited to sit is a small performance of hospitality that can also be a performance of control, and she had been thinking, on her walk down the corridor, about the various small ways in which she was going to stop letting the physical geography of the palace dictate where she was allowed to place herself. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his default register. Not unfriendly, not warm, not giving much away, but attentive, in a way that suggested he was taking in more than the surface. She said, "I met Lord Drace today." He said, "In the library." She said, "You know." He said, "I'm told most things that happen in the East Wing." She said, "What did he want to know?" He set down the paper he had been holding. He said, "Drace has a very clear picture of what he would like the next 6 months of this palace to look like. It doesn't match the picture that currently exists, and you are the central point of difference." She said, "Because of the baby." He said, "Because of the baby. And because of what the baby represents legally, in terms of line succession and territorial stability, and because of the fact that the treaty Drace has been building for 2 years is entirely dependent on a particular heir arrangement that your pregnancy has made significantly more complicated." She said, "The treaty was built on the promise of a different heir." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Yes." She absorbed this. She said, "What happened to the previous heir?" She watched something move across his face. Not pain, exactly, but the place where pain has been, and has settled into something denser and more permanent. He said, "An ambush. 14 months ago. My son. He was 4 years old." A pause. The ambush was not, as it was officially recorded, an accident. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the light was fading, the gray afternoon going into darker gray. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I know." And from the way he said it, she believed that he knew she meant it. She said, "So Drace built a new plan, a new treaty, a new heir arrangement, and then I appeared." He said, "You appeared, and the bloodline confirmed what I already knew, from the moment I recognized you on that platform." He looked at her directly. "I wasn't at the auction by coincidence. I had spent 3 months looking for a woman named Seraphine, who had worked the Thornvale event. I didn't know about the pregnancy. I found out in the physician's room along with everyone else." A brief pause. "But I was already there. I was already looking." She looked at him, and took this information, and held it alongside everything else she had been holding, and tried to determine what it meant, and how much of what it meant she could rely on. She said, "Why were you looking?" He said, "Because the night in the garden was the last time in 14 months that I felt like a person rather than a piece of a structure. And I am aware that is not a simple or entirely comfortable thing to say to someone you met once, briefly, 3 months ago." She did not answer immediately. She let the honesty of it sit in the room, because that was what it deserved. She said, "It wasn't simple for me either. The night in the garden." He said, "No." She said, "I carried the ring." He said, "I saw." A moment passed between them that was not resolution, and was not the beginning of something clear, but was the first time the distance in the room felt like something chosen rather than necessary. She said, "I need you to understand something. I am not a problem to be solved. I am not an heir arrangement. I am a person who is going to have a child, and the child is going to need an honest and stable world to be born into. Whatever the palace needs from this situation, I need those things too. And if those two sets of needs can work together, I am willing to be here. But if this becomes a situation where I am managed, where I am kept comfortable in a set of nice rooms, and kept out of the way, while decisions about my child's future are made by a council I have never met, that is not something I will cooperate with." She said it levelly. She was not angry. She was clear, which was different. He looked at her for a long time. He said, "I know what managed looks like. I've been managed all my life. I'm not interested in doing it to someone else." She said, "Then we need to talk about Drace." He said, "Yes, we do." She sat back in the chair. The fire in the grate at the side of the room was burning steadily. Outside, the dark had come fully now, and the window had become a reflection of the room itself, and in the glass, she could see both of them, him on one side of the desk, and her on the other. 2 people, at the beginning of a conversation, that was going to have to be very honest, if it was going to work at all. She said, "Tell me about the treaty." He picked up the paper again. He turned it around and set it on her side of the desk. She leaned forward and read the first paragraph, and kept reading. And by the time she reached the bottom of the page, she had a clear picture of exactly how much Lord Drace stood to lose if the arrangement on that paper became politically impossible. And she had a clear picture of exactly why, in the library that afternoon, his assessment had not resolved in her favor. She looked up. She said, "He's going to move." He said, "Yes." She said, "How much time do we have?" He said, "Less than I would like." She set the paper back on the desk. She said, "Then we should stop talking about whether we can trust each other and start talking about what we are actually going to do." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one that was not quite a smile but lived in the same space, and he reached past the document to the smaller stack of papers on the left side of the desk and said, "The council has a meeting in 6 days. This is what I know they'll bring." She settled into the chair. The fire burned. Outside the palace, the territory went about its evening business, knowing nothing of the conversation in the East Wing study, nothing of the treaty, or the bloodline, or the 4-year-old boy, or the night in the garden, or the ring wrapped in cloth. They talked for 2 hours. When she left and walked back to the East Wing, the corridor guards saw her pass and noted, without saying anything to each other, that her posture had changed. She was still carrying the same weight. She was carrying it differently now, not with the resigned straightness of someone performing composure, but with the forward angle of someone who has decided on a direction and has begun moving in it. This distinction, small as it seemed, was the kind of thing that people who watch palace corridors for a living learn to notice. It meant something. What it meant would become clearer in the days ahead, but the 2 guards at the end of the East Corridor, standing in the quiet of the late evening, both registered it in their own way, and both, independently, found themselves hoping, in the private and wordless way of people whose jobs require neutrality, that whatever was building in the East Wing was building towards something that held. The meeting of the High Council was held in the formal chamber on the 2nd floor of the palace's central wing, a room Seraphine had not yet been inside, and whose layout she knew only from what Kaelin had described to her during their 4 evenings of preparation over the past week. 16 members, arranged by seniority. Drace at the right of the head chair, the charter and precedent books on the shelves to the left, the record keeper in the corner with the open ledger, 2 high windows on the north wall that let in light in the morning and shadow in the afternoon. She was not in the room. She was in the corridor outside it, which was where she had been for the past 40 minutes, sitting on a carved stone bench set into the wall alcove, because Kaelin had asked her to wait there while the first portion of the session completed, and because she had agreed to that, and because she was trying, with limited success, to be patient. She could not hear the voices through the door. The chamber was built for discretion. She could hear, occasionally, the low sound of a voice rising above the others, the kind of rise that happens when a speaker is making a point with particular emphasis, and she thought she could identify Drace's register in that rise, though she was not certain enough to be sure. She pressed her back against the stone of the alcove and thought about what she knew. Drace had moved faster than Kaelin had anticipated. 3 days ago he had presented a preliminary challenge to the council's administrative secretary, invoking the charter clause around contested bloodline legitimacy, a clause that had not been used in 60 years, and that had been written for circumstances genuinely different from the current ones, but that existed, in unambiguous language, in the charter that governed the palace's legal functioning. The clause allowed a council majority to require independent tribunal review of any bloodline claim where the circumstances of conception were, in the formal language, insufficiently documented. Insufficiently documented. Seraphine had read the clause 3 times the evening Kaelin showed it to her. She had read it the way she read everything important, slowly and very carefully, not skimming for the general meaning, but reading for the precise, specific language, the words that carried the actual weight. The circumstances were not insufficiently documented. She could document them. She had worked the Thornvale event. Owen Pratt had the Heir records. She had found the ring on the estate grounds the following morning. She still had it, and the estate could confirm she had inquired about returning it. The physician had already confirmed the bloodline signature. The sequence of events was not a mystery. It was a straightforward factual record. The problem was not documentation. The problem was that Drace did not actually want documentation. He wanted process. He wanted the time that a tribunal would take, weeks, potentially months, during which Seraphine's status in the palace would be officially contested, and her position would carry no legal weight, and during which the treaty arrangements he had been building could be quietly finalized and placed on a foundation that would be very difficult to undo once formally signed. She had understood this the moment Kaylin explained it. She had said so, plainly, and Kaylin had confirmed that she understood it correctly. And then they had spent the subsequent 3 days working out what to do about it. The plan was straightforward in its concept, and required something she had been thinking about very carefully for 72 hours, which was whether she was capable of walking into a room full of 16 people who held considerable power, most of whom had no particular investment in her well-being, and speaking clearly, and without anger, and without apology, and doing so in a way that was precise enough to make the documentary record do what it needed to do. She was fairly sure she was capable of it. She had spent 3 months keeping a significant secret from everyone around her, without breaking, which required a kind of sustained, deliberate self-possession that she could now recognize in herself as a genuine quality, rather than simply the result of having no other option. She had presented her own accounts to the Ashwood Council when disputing a housing record the year before. She had spoken in front of a room before. She had been looked at by people who were assessing her and had remained steady. The difference was that none of those rooms had had this much at stake. The door opened. The council attendant who appeared in the corridor was a young man named Penn, who had been briefed and was very carefully not showing on his face what had been happening in the chamber for the past 40 minutes. He said, quietly, "They're ready for you." She stood up from the stone bench. She straightened her dress. She checked that her breathing was even, because she had found, in the past week, that her breathing was the most reliable indicator of how she was actually managing, as opposed to how she appeared to be managing, and she wanted to know the truth before she went in. Her breathing was even. She followed Penn through the door. The chamber was exactly as Kaylin had described it, and noting this, noting the accuracy of the description she had been given, settled something in her chest. 16 council members arranged by seniority, looking at her with the range of expressions that 16 people who have just been told someone is coming to speak tend to display, some openly curious, some neutral, some carefully evaluating, and one, at the right-hand chair of the head position, with an expression that was precisely controlled and showed nothing at all. Kaylin was at the head chair. He did not look at her when she entered the room, and she understood this, because looking at her when she entered the room would be a statement about their relationship, at a moment when the relationship was not yet the subject of the meeting. She did not look at him either. She looked at the space in front of the head table where the record keeper had indicated she should stand, and she walked to it, and she stood there. The council speaker, an older woman named Aldra who was not Drace's ally, and was not Kaylin's supporter in any obvious way, but was simply the longest-serving member, and therefore the procedural authority, said, "Miss Cole, you've requested time to address the council regarding the legitimacy challenge." Seraphine said, "I have. Thank you for receiving me." Aldra said, "You have the floor." She began. She spoke for just over 20 minutes. She did not perform emotion. She did not appeal to sympathy. She laid out the sequence of events factually and in precise order, beginning with the Thornvale event hire through Owen Pratt, the date and nature of her assignment, the encounter in the private garden section, the morning after when she found the ring, her attempts to return it through official channels, and the reason she had ultimately not succeeded in returning it through those channels, which was that the channels had redirected her without resolution, and she had run out of time. She described the months of managing the pregnancy alone, without resources or support. She described what she had known and not known about the man in the garden. She described arriving at the Ashwood auction with no alternative available and no ability to refuse placement on the rolls. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She said what happened and when and why, in the plain language of someone who has nothing to conceal and is sufficiently confident in the factual record to present it without embellishment. 2 members of the council who had been looking at the table when she began were looking at her directly by the time she finished. The physician was called. His testimony took 8 minutes. He confirmed the Bloodline signature with clinical precision, answered 3 technical questions from council members in the same manner, and sat down. Aldra called for the hire records, which had been obtained from Owen Pratt's market office the day before, and were presented by the council clerk. The records confirmed the date, the assignment, the rate paid, the name of the contracting estate. Drace spoke twice. The first time was a procedural objection to the speed of the proceedings, which Aldra overruled on technical grounds. The second time was a statement questioning whether the bloodline confirmation alone was sufficient grounds to bypass tribunal review, at which point 3 council members turned to look at him with the particular expression of people who have just understood what the procedural objection was actually about, and have made a decision about it. Kalen spoke once. He stood and looked at the record keeper and said, clearly and without inflection, that he was formally acknowledging the legitimacy of the bloodline claim on record, and that the acknowledgement was irrevocable under Chapter 14 of the governing charter, and that he was so stating for the official record in front of full council witness. The record keeper wrote it down. The ink dried. Drace was very still. Aldra called for a brief recess. In the 10 minutes of the recess, Seraphine stood in the corner of the chamber and drank a glass of water that Penn brought her and did not speak to anyone, and Drace stood at the far end of the room in conversation with 2 council members who, she noticed, ended the conversation within 3 minutes and walked away in separate directions. By the time the recess ended and Aldra called the session back to order, the arrangement of bodies in the room had shifted, and what the shift communicated was clear enough that she did not need anyone to translate it for her. After the vote, 11-5 in favor of closing the legitimacy challenge with the bloodline acknowledgement on record, she walked back out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand flat against the stone wall. Penn appeared and offered her another glass of water. She took it. She drank half of it. But Kalen came out of the chamber 4 minutes later. He walked to where she was standing, and he stood beside her, not facing her, but facing the corridor, the way 2 people stand when they are together in a situation and are briefly just letting the situation settle around them before anything further needs to be said. He said, "You were very clear in there." She said, "I had good preparation." He said, "The preparation helped. The clarity was yours." She looked at the corridor wall opposite. She said, "Is it done?" He said, "The legitimacy challenge is." Drace himself is a longer conversation, and the treaty has to be formally unwound, which is going to take several months and a number of difficult meetings with the other territorial parties. But the immediate threat, specifically the threat to you and the child, yes, that is done. She said, "What happens to Drace?" He said, "There is a separate inquiry. Into the ambush. I've been building that case for 14 months. Today gave me the council majority I needed to formally open it." A pause. "It will take time, but it will be opened." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about a 4-year-old boy on a river path. She thought about the particular, precise way Kalen's face had looked when he said, 14 months ago, and did not say anything else. She said, "I'm sorry it took this long to get to that." He turned his head and looked at her. He said, "So am I." And then, after a moment, "Thank you for what you did in there." She said, "Thank you for telling me the truth. All of it. It made it possible to do the job properly." They stood in the corridor for another minute without speaking, and the palace moved around them, the quiet footsteps and the distant doors, and the particular sound of a large building going about its afternoon, carrying no awareness of the small and significant thing that had just been settled in the chamber behind them. She said, "I'm going to need a better chair in the sitting room. The one by the window is uncomfortable after an hour." He said, "I'll have Petra arrange it." She said, "And I want access to the library. Not scheduled access. Open access." He said, "Done." She said, "And at some point, when things have settled enough that it's not in the middle of everything else, I think we should talk about the garden." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like that." She nodded once and walked back toward the east wing, and this time when she passed the guards at the end of the corridor, the quality in her posture was entirely different from the one she had arrived with 8 days ago. Not performed confidence, not management of an impression. Just the plain, grounded quality of a person who has done the thing and knows it was done well and is walking forward into whatever the next day is going to require. The formal announcement that the Voss bloodline claim had been confirmed and placed on official record was made to the palace household the following morning. It was read by the council speaker, Aldra, in the receiving hall, in plain language, without elaboration. The announcement was not long. It did not describe the events leading to it, or the challenge that had been raised, or the vote that had resolved it. It said what had been confirmed, and that it was confirmed by the appropriate processes, and that the record was closed. Seraphine was not present for the announcement. She had chosen not to be, because being present for an announcement about yourself in a room full of people who are watching to see how you receive it, is a specific kind of performance she did not have any interest in giving. She was in the library, reading, at the long table by the south window, with a cup of tea that Petra had brought her cooling at her elbow, and the pale winter light coming in at an angle that was just sufficient for reading without straining. She had been in the library for 3 days in a row now, since Kaylin had confirmed the open access arrangement, and it had already become the part of the day she looked forward to most, not because the books were exceptional, though some of them were, but because the library had the quality she valued most in a space right now, which was that it was quiet without being empty, that it had the company of things without the requirement of performance. She could sit here and think, which was something she had not had enough room to do in the East Wing sitting room, which was associated in her mind with waiting and uncertainty, and the particular alertness of a person who is unsure whether the next knock at the door is going to be good news or bad. The library, she had decided, was not going to be associated with waiting. She was rewriting what it was associated with, deliberately, beginning with the third morning. She was 3 chapters into a territorial legal history that she had found on the 4th shelf from the left, when she heard the library door open, and, without looking up, identified the footstep from its weight and pace. She said, without raising her eyes from the page, "The announcement has been made." He said, 20 minutes ago. She said, "How was the room?" He said, "Mixed, as expected." He came to the table and took the chair across from her, which was the chair she had come to think of as the one available for visitors, because it was the only one at the table that was not occupied by either her own things or a stack of books she was working through in a particular order. He said, "Lady Marin's representative has requested a meeting. The treaty conversation is beginning." She said, "Good." She turned a page. He said, "You're not going to ask about the details?" She said, "I'll ask about the details when you want to tell me about them. You didn't come to the library to talk about the treaty meeting." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "No, I didn't." She set the book down and looked at him. In the pale light of the library window, without the formality of the corridor or the desk or the council chamber, he looked like what she had seen on the garden bench 3 months ago, which was a person who was tired in the specific way of someone who has been responsible for very large things for a long time without pause, and who has not had a great many places to set that tiredness down. She said, "How long since you've had a full night's sleep?" He said, "Months." She said, "That's not good for you." He said, "I know." She said, "The inquiry will take time. The treaty unwinding will take time. But those things are in motion now. You don't have to carry the before and the after simultaneously anymore." He said, "The before doesn't go away, because the after has started." She said, "No, it doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "But it changes." "I know it changes because I have a before too, and mine has changed in the past 3 weeks, and I didn't expect it to, and it hasn't disappeared, but it's different now. It has a different weight." He looked at her. He said, "What's your before?" She said, 8 months of managing alone. And before that, 6 years of a version of alone that had my father in it, which was better than actual alone, but still had the particular quality of a thing, with a shape that was not quite right, because we had both lost someone, and neither of us knew how to name that in a way that made it easier. And before that, being 16 years old, and coming downstairs to a house where my mother had been, and then wasn't, and not having been told it was coming, and not understanding for several years whether I was supposed to be angry about it, or whether I was simply supposed to accept it as a thing that had happened. He said, "Are you angry about it?" She said, "Sometimes, less than I used to be. I understand. More now than I did at 16. How a person can arrive at a decision that looks from the outside like abandonment, but is from the inside a matter of survival. I don't know what my mother's inside looked like. I never got to ask her." A pause. "I would like to ask her, if I ever have the chance. Not to make it right, but just to understand." He said, "I understand that. Wanting to understand more than wanting to be given back what was taken." She said, "Yes." The library was quiet around them. From somewhere in the building, far away, the muffled sound of a bell, marking the mid-morning hour, came through the walls. He said, "I'd like to tell you about my son." She said, "I'd like to hear about him." He said, "His name was Edmund. He had dark hair, and was very serious for 4 years old, which his nursemaid found occasionally alarming, and I found privately funny, because it was exactly what I had been like as a child, according to everyone who remembered me at that age. He liked the garden below the east wing, specifically the stone fountain, which he had decided by age 3 was a significant and important object. He had opinions about it. He paused. He had opinions about a great many things, which I was looking forward to growing along with him. She said, "He sounds like he was wonderful." He said, "He was." A pause, and the pause had the weight of the word that had been past tense instead of present. He was very much his own person, even at 4. That's something I think about. That he was already himself, already distinct, already becoming the specific person he was going to be. That doesn't stop when someone is gone. The becoming stopped, but the already being himself part is still true. He was already himself. She said, quietly, "He was." They sat in the library for a while longer. She did not offer comfort in the form of solutions or redirection. She simply sat in the room with the information about Edmund, and let it be present, and he sat across the table from her and seemed, for those minutes, slightly less alone inside it. When he left, an hour later, he said at the door, "Thank you for listening." She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "The chair in your sitting room. I've asked Petra to replace it. There should be a better one by this afternoon." She said, "Good." He left. She picked up the territorial legal history and found her place again and read, slowly, in the quiet of the library, while outside the palace, day moved forward with all its arrangements and its ongoing processes and its people going carefully about the business of the next thing. She was still there when the afternoon light shifted, and Petra appeared in the doorway with a small tray and the information that the new chair had been placed by the window and that dinner was available whenever Seraphine wished. She finished the paragraph she was reading. She marked the page. She gathered her things. She walked back to the east wing, and this time the corridor felt less like a passage between uncertain places and more like a route between known ones. And the difference between those two things, she knew from experience, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the beginning of the thing that takes the longest to build and that cannot be manufactured or hurried or arranged by treaty. Outside, in the bare winter garden below the east wing window, the small stone fountain stood in the pale late afternoon light, still and deliberate, in the way of things built to last. Edmund Voss had come into the world on a morning in spring, 7 weeks earlier than expected, with a thin, insistent cry that the attending physician had said, with visible relief, was a very good sign. He weighed significantly less than he should have. He was placed in a warming cabinet for the first 4 days of his life, while his lungs finished the job they had started prematurely, and Seraphine sat beside the cabinet for most of those 4 days, in a chair that Kaelin had carried in from the corridor himself, because the one originally provided was a formal thing not designed for sustained sitting, and he had noticed, by the second morning, that she had stopped shifting positions because she was too tired to bother. The baby was small and very alive, and completely unaware of what he represented, or what his arrival had cost the people in the room around him, which was one of the most beautiful and most clarifying things about him. She had not expected to feel this much. She had been expecting love, she had understood, from the months of carrying him alone, that she was already committed to this child in a way that was beyond calculation. But she had not been expecting this specific texture of love, which was urgent and terrifying, and entirely without conditions, a love that was not built toward anything, or contingent on anything, but simply was, fully and immediately, from the first moment she saw him. Kaelin had been in the room when Edmund arrived. He had not been there by arrangement or by ceremony. He had been there because, 3 days before the early labor began, they had had the kind of conversation that neither of them had quite planned to have, sitting in the library on a gray afternoon, and the conversation had arrived at the subject of what kind of arrangement they were actually in, and what kind of arrangement they wanted to be in, and what the difference was between those two things. The arrangement they were in, officially, was a palace protection, with a formal bloodline acknowledgement and an ongoing legal process that was resolving steadily in the right direction. Drace's inquiry had been formally opened 6 weeks after the council session and was proceeding with the slow, methodical quality of a process that had sufficient evidence and was simply working through it. The treaty unwinding had taken the predicted several months and several difficult meetings, and Lady Marin had departed the territory 2 months prior, with the formal conclusion she had been owed, which was not the conclusion she had wanted, but was the one the circumstances now required. The palace was not, exactly, what it had been before Seraphine arrived, but it was not entirely clear yet what it was instead. The arrangement they wanted to be in, this was the question they had been approaching carefully, from various angles, over the months since the council chamber. It had not been a simple question, and they had not been in a hurry to force it into a shape it was not ready for, because both of them had the particular wariness of people who have been hurt by things moving too fast or too carelessly, and both of them had enough self-knowledge by this point to recognize the wariness for what it was, and to choose patience over it, while also not letting the patience become avoidance. On the gray afternoon in the library, she had said, simply, "I think I would like to know what this is, not what it needs to be politically, what it actually is, between us." He had said, "I think you already know what it is. I think you have known for a while." She had said, "I want to hear you say it." He had said, "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since approximately the second hour in the garden, which I recognize as fast, and which I also know, having spent the subsequent months with fairly conclusive evidence, is not a temporary condition." She had looked at the table for a moment. She had said, "I am in love with you too." That is a sentence I did not expect to be saying in a palace library, in the winter of a year that has been the most difficult and most important year of my life. He had said, "No, nor I." They had sat with it for a while, and then she had said, practically, "So what do we do with that?" And he had said, "Whatever we decide to do with it, we decide together." Which was, she had thought, and still thought, the right answer. Not a perfect answer, not an answer that resolved everything or promised everything, but the right one, the one that put the decision where the decision belonged. Edmund, arriving early and insistently 7 weeks later, seemed to have his own opinion on the subject of their hesitation, and that opinion appeared to be that it had gone on long enough. He was 4 days old, and newly out of the warming cabinet, and properly in his mother's arms, when Kaelin came into the room in the early evening, with the quiet, specific carefulness of a person, trying not to wake a sleeping child who has, 3 seconds after the person enters the room, woken up anyway. Edmund opened dark eyes, dark like Seraphine's, not silver, though the physician had noted the silver sometimes takes time to show in Voss children, and looked at Kaelin with the unfocused, total attention of a newborn who does not yet have the capacity for judgment and is simply registering the world. Seraphine watched Kaelin's face in that moment. She had been watching his face for several months, and she had become good at reading it, and what she read now was not ceremony, or duty, or political awareness, or any of the careful, managed qualities she had seen him deploy in professional settings. What she read was simpler and more fundamental than any of those things. She said, softly, so as not to startle the baby, "Would you like to hold him?" He sat down in the chair he had carried in from the corridor, and she placed Edmund carefully in his arms, and he held him with the instinctive, slightly too careful grip of someone who has held a child before, and is bringing that knowledge into this specific, new, unrepeatable moment. Edmund yawned. He was not interested in ceremony. Kaelin looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Hello." His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. In all the months of corridors and council rooms and library afternoons and working evenings at the desk. Entirely unguarded, entirely present. The voice of a person who is not managing anything, who is simply here. She looked away from them, out the east wing window at the garden below. It was evening, and the bare branches had the particular silver quality they get in late winter light, and the stone fountain stood at the center of the garden as it always had, still and deliberate, as permanent as any of the things that had been built here to last. She thought about Edmund, her Edmund, the lost one, who had liked this garden and had opinions about its fountain. She thought about the 4-year-old boy who had been himself, fully and completely, and who remained himself even now in the quality of the room he had left behind him, in the way his father sat in a chair and held a new child with a combination of experience and freshness that was specific to a man who had learned, through the hardest possible lesson, how to hold nothing lightly. She thought about the river path and her father. She thought about the morning the house was quiet and her mother's bag was gone. She thought about 8 months of managing alone in a narrow room above a kitchen, and the afternoon she had found a ring on a wet garden bench and made the quiet, irrational, entirely correct decision to keep it. She thought about a cold hall and 200 watching faces and the specific quality of a hand closing around her arm before she hit the floor. She did not think that everything had worked out, because everything had not worked out. Some things had been lost that would not be recovered, and some questions had no available answers, and some of what had been taken from Kaylin in the past 14 months would remain taken, regardless of what the inquiry concluded, or the treaty resolved, or time arranged. She was clear-eyed about this. She had always been clear-eyed about the distance between how things are and how one might wish them to be, and she did not intend to stop being clear-eyed now simply because the present moment was better than she had dared, at various points in the previous year, to expect. But she thought, enough. Not everything. Not a resolution that fixed the unfixable, or replaced what could not be replaced. Just enough. A person who had become a partner. A child who had arrived loud and insistent, and entirely himself. A palace that was still complicated, and still full of ongoing processes, and still had, in various corners, people with various agendas, because that was what a palace was, and she had accepted this, and intended to remain navigating it with her eyes open. A library that was hers, with open access, any reasonable hour. A window that looked over a garden with a fountain that a 4-year-old boy had considered significant and important. A ring in her pocket, still, because she had never actually put it away, because putting it away would have meant something was over that was not over, and now it was not over, and she intended to carry it a while longer simply because she chose to. Kaylin looked up from Edmund and found her looking at the window. He said her name, quietly, and she turned. He said, "He's looking at the lantern." Just like the garden. She looked at their son, who was, in fact, gazing with the total focus of a newborn at the small lamp on the table nearby, his dark eyes wide and entirely absorbed. He had, apparently, an opinion about this lamp. The opinion was favorable. She said, "He has good taste." Kaylin looked at her, with the expression that was no longer something she needed to translate, because she had learned its language, and it was not a difficult language once you knew it, and what it said, in plain terms, was, "Yes, and I think so too, and I am here, and I intend to keep being here, and whatever comes next, we will work out together in the library, or the study, or the corridor, or wherever the conversation needs to happen, for as long as it takes, until we have built something that holds." She reached over and straightened Edmund's blanket where it had slipped at the corner, a small, automatic, entirely ordinary gesture, the first of what would become thousands of them, and she thought, this is the part that stories don't usually tell. Not the auction, or the ring, or the council chamber, or the storm-lit corridor confession. This, the evening, the lamp, the baby who has an opinion about it, the man in the chair who is learning, for the second time, how to hold something small and alive without holding it too tight. This is the part that is harder than everything that came before it, and more important, and will last longer. She was not afraid of it. She had never been afraid of difficulty. She had only, for a long time, been alone with it. She was not alone with it anymore. Outside, in the winter garden below the east wing, the stone fountain caught the last of the evening light, and in the room above it, in the quiet of the late hour, the ordinary and extraordinary business of a life rebuilt from the ground up continued forward into the night.